Thanks for joining us for CBN News Watch. I'm Mark Martin. Today, the death toll is still rising after the massive destruction caused by devastating tornadoes across the Midwest. But help is on the way from different parts of the country. Some military personnel are still waiting for a decision on their requests for religious exemptions from vaccine mandates. And many say they're being robbed of their religious liberties. Plus, it's called the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions. Its target is Israel, and it's spreading here in the U.S.
Particularly on college campuses, teaching them, I think, a lot of falsehoods about Israel, about its history, about its politics.
We'll look at the tactics and history of this campaign. Thinking about giving your child a smartphone for Christmas?
They can be dangerous, they can be harmful, and oftentimes it's resulting in anxiety and depression for our kids.
We'll bring you some advice on how to protect your kids from potential online threats. And an historic find in the Holy Land, a synagogue in the region of the Sea of Galilee where Jesus may have preached. Those stories and more today on CBN NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin with the aftermath of the tornado devastation in the Midwest. The death toll continues to climb, with now at least 88 lives lost across 5 states. Kentucky was the hardest hit, with at least 74 deaths there, and the search continues with more than 100 people still unaccounted for. At the same time, help is coming from all corners of the country. CBN's Jenna Browder has the story.
It's day 4 of cleanup and recovery in the country's heartland as we learn more about the storm's victims and hear harrowing stories of survival.
It happened so fast. I mean, the glass was flying and then the roof come down and the walls are caving in.
In hard-hit Mayfield, Kentucky, this man's home was left in shambles.
Like a war zone. Unimaginable.
Many losing everything.
We lost everything. We lost our home. We lost all of our vehicles, all of our belongings. We basically have nothing.
At least 44 tornadoes reported across 9 states, the deadliest tornado outbreak in the U.S. in more than a decade. Homes and businesses flattened, damage as far as the eye can see.
The whole building fell. We are stuck.
This cell phone video taken by a woman stuck inside a candle factory that collapsed. In Illinois, 6 people died in an Amazon warehouse that also collapsed. OSHA is investigating. An emotional governor of Kentucky on his state's rising death count.
Of the ones that we know, the age range is 5 months to 86 years, and 6 are younger than 18.
In Missouri, a young victim mourned. 9-year-old Addiston Rackley died in the storm. Her mother, Megan, still fighting for her life. The community coming together to pray.
Lord, for all the nurses and the doctors.
Meanwhile, support from across the country is pouring in.
Did y'all get food?
The Salvation Army among the organizations distributing food and supplies.
A lot of this area is a poorer area, and rebuilding is going to take time. And the big thing is, the outpour of love and affection and support is here now. This is day 3, day 4, but what's going to happen on week 2, week 3, week 4?
CBN's Operation Blessing, working with church partners on the ground to deliver food, water, and other necessities.
There are those immediate things, food, warmth, sometimes tarps, things of that nature.
And President Biden has approved a disaster declaration for Kentucky and says he'll soon approve an emergency request for Illinois. He's expected to visit Kentucky tomorrow. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
In other news, the Supreme Court has refused to block a New York State COVID vaccine requirement for healthcare workers that does not offer a religious exemption. The mandate went into effect in August. It does allow medical exceptions, but not religious exemptions. The High Court turned away a challenge from Christian doctors and nurses and other medical workers. Justices Clarence Thomas, Neil Gorsuch, and Samuel Alito would have voted in favor of blocking the mandate, but they were in the minority. New York is one of just 3 states that does not accommodate healthcare workers who object to the vaccine on religious grounds. The others are Maine and Rhode Island. The COVID-19 vaccination deadlines for most active duty service members have passed, and so far not a single religious exemption has been granted. The deadline for the U.S. Army is tomorrow. It's already passed for the other branches of the armed forces, but some military personnel are still waiting for a decision on their requests for religious exemptions. As national security correspondent Caitlin Burke reports, a growing number say they're being robbed of their religious liberties.
Service members waiting on their religious exemption requests remain in limbo. While accustomed to following orders, those speaking with me say their faith won't allow them to comply with this one.
It goes against my bodily sovereignty as a Christian. I mean, God makes it very clear that for me, this body that I'm given, this is my last bastion of freedom.
At the request of counsel, this service member asked not to be identified. He told CBN News that he received other vaccines from the military without doing much research. That wasn't the case when it came to the COVID-19 shot.
This is something that's supposed to be good for me, and yet I'm being punished if I do not take something that's good for me. When that was the case, when that happened, I've been to question, why is this being forced so heavily on us?
In his exemption request, he cites fetal cell lines used in the research and development phase of the mRNA vaccines and in the production of Johnson & Johnson's shot. If his request isn't granted, he says he'll take a discharge before going against his beliefs. First Liberty Institute is representing a group of 35 Navy SEALs seeking an exemption with similar concerns. Attorney Mike Berry argues it's unconstitutional for their requests to be denied.
That's blatant discrimination. You can't treat religious beliefs less favorably than you treat medical conditions or administrative exemptions. Religious freedom in our country is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution, and that doesn't change just because you serve in the military.
The National Faith Advisory Board, a group of more than 1,700 religious leaders organized by former President Donald Trump, is urging the Secretary of Defense to grant these religious accommodations, writing, quote, "Religious freedom is enshrined in our Constitution and must always be protected." Pentagon spokesman John Kirby tells CBN News religious exemptions are rare. For example, none has been granted in either the Navy or Marines in almost a decade.
It's not about liberties. It's about a military medical requirement to keep them safe, to keep their families safe, to keep their units safe. And the Secretary continues to strongly believe that these vaccines are the best way to do it with respect to COVID.
I heard back from a Navy spokesman who told me that there is no blanket policy about denying religious exemption requests. Each is considered on a case-by-case basis. There are, however, very strict guidelines that must be met, including a history of objecting to vaccination. Anyone who does object and refuses to comply with getting vaccinated, Christian or not, will be given a general discharge. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
In a related story, the Air Force says it has discharged 27 airmen because they would not get the COVID vaccine. They did not apply for a religious or medical exemption, but simply said they would not get the shot. The Air Force gave its forces until November 2nd to get the vaccine, and thousands have either refused or sought an exemption. Officials believe these are the first service members to be removed for disobeying the vaccine mandate. Coming up, it's called the BDS movement, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Against Israel. We'll look at its history, and we'll also show you how it's spreading on college campuses here in the U.S. We'll bring you that story when we come back. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that targets Israel was back in the headlines recently after a recent decision from Ben & Jerry's. The ice cream makers have stopped doing business in what's called the occupied Palestinian territories, otherwise known as the West Bank. The BDS movement is also flourishing across college campuses. And as Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, that's cause for even greater concern.
Ben & Jerry's decision gave a boost to the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, or BDS, and raised questions about where it gets its funding.
You've got a lot of groups that are operating on, what appear to be shoestring budgets, but yet we continue to see the BDS movement flourish and thrive across various campuses. I think what it means is that this is a very decentralized funding network.
In 2016, Jonathan Schanzer testified before Congress and shared his research into the funding of the BDS movement.
But then finally stumbled on one group called American Muslims for Palestine. Many of them worked for charities that were previously shut down by the U.S. government for supporting Hamas. This, of course, came as a surprise to us. The more we dug, the more we realized that there was a network, a relatively small one, but apparently influential, that was active on campus. I think it ultimately demonstrated that even if this group is not engaging in anything illegal, and I think it's important to stress that their background is important, that this is not just simply a social justice movement, but rather a group that is motivated by very ideological reasons.
Schanzer tells CBN News the network is doing now what it did in 2016. In a related development, Israel recently targeted 6 NGOs for aiding the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP. That group is designated as a terror organization by the U.S.
So what we're also seeing is that a number of these so-called charities and NGOs really cover for terror groups like PFLP and others as a way to funnel money that ultimately goes to these groups for the purpose of carrying out boycott activities.
Arsen Ostrovsky says boycott activities go back 20 years to the movement's beginning at a UN conference in South Africa designed to fight racism.
It ended up coming together to promote racism and against one state and one state only, the Jewish state Israel.
Annette Wells says that helped propel BDS to become a key weapon against the Jewish state. She points out the main BDS tactic is to demonize and delegitimize Israel. Through its signs are placards.
The placard strategy is the equations that everyone who goes to an anti-Israel demonstration sees on their placards. Zionism equals, or Israel equals, or the Star of David equals. These words in our collective consciousness, they connote evil. So what happens through the placard strategy is basically people are exposed to an ongoing refrain that says Zionism, Israel, Star of David equals evil.
That, according to Wilf, promotes the idea of Israel as the global villain.
There is no greater good in this world than the eradication of evil. So if you create this mental mindset, you create a global mindset that there is an evil out there, and the evil is Israel and Zionism. You're basically saying, because Israel, Zionism, and the Star of David are evil, whatever you do to rid the world of this evil will be justified.
Ostrovsky says this helps explain the growth of violence worldwide against Jews earlier this year during Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza.
Now, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is a direct result of this pervasive discourse singling out and vilifying the Jewish state for opprobrium, and that goes to the very core, the very center of what the BDS movement is doing.
And since much of this discourse happens at colleges and universities, BDS creates an unsafe place for young Jewish students.
Especially students who identify as Zionist or pro-Israel.
The economic impact of BDS on Israel seems minimal, especially as the startup nation gets financially stronger through ties with its Arab neighbors and the Abraham Accords. Schanzer warns, however, the battleground is not so much the economy, but the hearts and minds of the next generations.
Particularly on college campuses, teaching them, I think, a lot of falsehoods about Israel, about its history, about its politics. And this will certainly make things more difficult for Israel in the future as it battles future generations of what we would call BDSers. And I think this really represents the great challenge, not a well-funded movement, as some people might suggest. It is the dedication to the destruction of the Jewish state. And unfortunately, this is something that has been around for 7+ decades and counting.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, planning on giving your child a smartphone for Christmas? Learn how to protect your kids from potential online threats. We'll have that advice for you right after this. Welcome back to Newswatch. As Christmas quickly approaches, millions of kids will be receiving their first smartphone. And while this is an exciting time for young people, parents need to prepare for the dangers their child could face using it. I spoke with Sean Clifford, the founder of a safety app that works to keep kids safe, and he joined me and Charlene Aaron on CBN's The Prayer Link to share how parents can navigate threats that their children could face. Some kids will be receiving cell phones for the first time this Christmas. What are your thoughts on this?
Never before have devices been so central to the life of your average American child, whether it's the education or their socializing. So on the one hand, we know that these devices are incredibly important for kids. On the other hand, they come with a host of challenges that we now understand better than before. They can be dangerous, they can be harmful, and oftentimes it's resulting in anxiety and depression for our kids. Wow. So the great question for us is, how do we figure out how to live with them, because they're not going away, but making sure that we're getting the good without the bad.
And Sean, what are these kids likely to encounter online in this new age of social media and the internet?
That's great. Well, I'll take those two in turn. On social media, look, you're finding unrealistic expectations. So imagine spending much of your day seeing highly filtered, highly selected images that effectively show you that which you don't have and that which is unrealistic. And that's setting norms and expectations which aren't good for our kids. The second aspect of social media is, for the first time, your popularity or your standing among your peers actually has a scoreboard. And you can measure it in little likes and clicks and things like that. And that just creates a sense of anxiety because where you stand is constantly shifting, which also can be problematic. So we've seen in the numbers, rates of reported depression have doubled for both boys and girls. This predates COVID. And so this has been a long-term trend that's really associated with the adoption of social media. So there are things we need to be mindful of on that front. On the internet side, it's kids have never been exposed to this quantity of what we call new pornography. It's more accessible, it's nearly infinite, and it's therefore that much more likely to be addictive. And it used to be you had to look hard to find it. Now you have to work hard to avoid it.
All right, Sean, well, tell us about Canopy and how parents can use it to protect their kids.
Well, thank you so much. Canopy is the only tool of its time that's able to identify pornography on the internet wherever it exists and prevent it from actually appearing on your child's device. We've got artificial intelligence that scans internet traffic in real time, in milliseconds. We can identify nudity and pornography and make sure that it's not populating on a screen, whether it's a brand new pornographic site or a site that has mixed content, good and bad. We can pull out the bad and still make sure that you're getting the good.
Wow. Sean, a recent study found that 1 out of 7 young people in America have sent what's called a sext, a text message, basically, that includes fully nude or semi-nude photos. And the problem has actually become worse since the pandemic. Talk about that.
So the last study that I saw was that 2/3 of American teenage girls have been asked to send a nude photo of themselves to someone that they actually know, usually an upperclassman at high school. So this is a growing phenomenon. I know it's hard to imagine for many parents that grew up before this time, but the data is just going up, and COVID exacerbated this and made it much more common, regrettably. So as this takes hold, one of the things that we're trying to do is give parents tools to ensure that their kids can't send sext. So we've got artificial intelligence that can identify it and stop it before it goes out.
Yeah, let's talk about those ways. What are some practical ways that parents can safeguard their kids' digital presence?
Absolutely. I think the first thing is you have to adopt safeguards. Just like you wouldn't give your 7-year-old keys to the car and just say, good luck. When you're giving them a device, you need to make sure that there are boundaries in place, both in terms of the rules that you adopt in your house, but also the tools that you put on the device itself. So Canopy can be a safeguard to make sure they're not exposed to pornography. For the rules in your house, we think it's great to bound devices in space and time. At the Clifford household, we never have devices at the table. There's a basket right when you walk in our front door. You put your device in there. You don't carry it around to rooms or other places. And then in time, you shouldn't have your device be the last thing you see when you go to bed or the first thing you see when you wake up. Simple rules like this that communicate to your child that there are a time and place for these devices can be helpful because, again, they're amazing and we all love them and we know the power of things that we can get from them, but we also need to make sure that we're using them in the right ways.
Awesome. This is practical advice for parents, too, as I was thinking about that.
It is.
So really quickly, Sean, how can people find out more about Canopy?
Thank you so much for asking. You can visit our website, canopy.us, and there we walk through all the amazing technology that we brought to bear here, but also some tips that we have for parents. This is hard. We're the first generation raising digital natives, and the playbook's a little bit unclear. So we both want to provide them with tools, but then also some tips along the way. So again, it's canopy.us.
You can catch more of the prayer link tonight at 6:30 Eastern on the CBN News Channel or on demand on the CBN News app. Coming up, a discovery from biblical days, a synagogue from the time of Jesus, a building where he may have preached. We'll bring you that story right after this. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with Newswatch. The discovery of a 2,000-year-old synagogue in the Galilee region is offering a new window into life during Jesus' time. Israeli archaeologists say they found the synagogue in the town of Migdal, located on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was the second discovery of a synagogue from biblical times. In 2009, one of the most well-preserved synagogues from the time of the Second Temple was found, and archaeologists say the second synagogue reflected a need for a building dedicated for Torah reading and study. The town is well known for being the home of Mary Magdalene, and it's possible Jesus might have preached in one or both of these synagogues. He performed miracles in the Galilee region as well. Migdal is the only place in the world where two synagogues from the Second Temple period have been found in the same area. You can find out more about this discovery and its biblical background. It's all at cbnnews.com. That would be a wonderful trip. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of CBN News Watch. Remember, you can find more of our news programs on the CBN News Channel anytime or online with cbnnews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories you've seen by emailing newswatch@cbn.com, or you can talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.